This Lightwave 3D Quickstart video provides instruction for both 4.0 and 5.0 versions of Lightwave 3D. We suggest following along in Lightwave while viewing this videotape. Then use the index reference card included with the tape to quickly locate information you'd like to review. Please take a few moments to fill out the enclosed registration card for future updates. Thank you. A special note for Macintosh users. For any functions mentioned using the right mouse button, hold down the Apple key and click the mouse.
Hello, I'm John Gross, and welcome to Getting Started with Lightwave 3D. This tape is designed to be an introduction to some of the basic features found in Lightwave Layout and Lightwave Modeler. Lightwave's designed to work under a number of different operating systems, including Amigas, Windows and Windows NT running under PCs, Alpha-based workstations, and MIPS-based workstations, and also SGIs. For this tape, we're using an Alpha-based workstation running at 275 megahertz, running Windows NT. At this point, I assume that you've already gotten Lightwave and Modeler installed, and so we're going to dive right in. In Program Manager, you'll find the Lightwave group, which includes icons for both Lightwave and Modeler. Now, Modeler is where you build your objects and give them surface names, and Layout is where you actually load them up, move them around, and create animations. So the first program we're going to go into is Layout. So let's double-click on that to get in. And here we see the basic Lightwave screen. And this is the main layout window right here. This is the soundstage that you, as the director, set up your scenes. At the top of the screen, we have a number of different buttons, which when clicked on will present different panels that allow you to deal with different functions in Lightwave. The first thing we want to do before we begin is go to the Options panel. We're going to click on that and change where Lightwave looks for its content. Now, the content is all the stuff that you installed with Lightwave, including the images, objects, scene files, etc. By default, the content directory is set to C:NewTek. Now, you may not have installed your Lightwave in C:NewTek. You may have installed it on a different drive or even in a different directory, so you need to tell Lightwave where that is. So by clicking on the content directory button, you'll be presented with a requester which will ask you where that directory is located. On this machine, Lightwave was installed in the fNewTek directory, so I want to say fNewTek. And notice that the file name says none. There's no need to give it a file name because we're just selecting a directory here. As we go down, you'll notice that we have the objects, images, scenes directory. This is the area we want to point Lightwave to. So all I have to do is say OK, changes the content directory to fNewTek, and when I hit continue, it will remember that. And now when I quit Lightwave and start the next time, that's remembered, and you won't have to change that again.
In Lightwave 5.0, some of the panels have been changed. In the Options panel, the content directory is located at the top of the menu. This is due to the new Tabs feature. Each tab groups functions according to subject for easy access.
Okay, so let's go to Objects, and I'm going to select the Load Object button. Notice we have a number of other different objects in here which let you adjust things like shadows, how dissolved an object is, etc. For now, we're going to load an object. And notice it defaults to the objects directory that's located in fNewTek, which is where we want to be. And I'm just going to go to the animals directory and load up the object called cow.lwo. By default, Lightwave looks for a .lwo extension, but you can change it down here by telling it to look at all files or just the object files. So let's select cow.lwo. I can either select it once and hit OK, or I can double click on it to select that file. You'll notice that it says that I have one object loaded. It tells me what that current object is. So when I hit continue, notice we'll now have an object in the middle of our interface, and that's the cow. Now we start by thinking of this as a sound stage. You're the director. You have your camera and your lights, and you have your objects or your actors that you can manipulate. First of all, we want to choose a view as to how to look at this scene. Right now, by default, we're in the perspective view, and that's just a third-party point of view. We're outside of the camera looking in, sort of like a director. I can decide to look at this from the front, which will show me just a flat orthographic projection from the front of this. I can look at it from the top, which is down, looking down upon it, from the side, the perspective view, which we've already looked at. I can look at it through the view of any light, and I can also look at it through the view of the camera. Now you're going to want to get used to looking at it from the camera view, because when you make the images in Lightwave or render them, Lightwave will render them from the camera's point of view. By default, we're in the perspective view, which allows us to look at it from the director's point of view, or outside of the camera.
In Lightwave 5.0, there's an additional function in the Options panel labeled Use OpenGL. When activated, objects will be displayed in full solid shaded color in the Layout view. This also enables the ability to view the effects of lighting on objects for more accurate placement. In the Layout display, the wireframe is now viewed as a solid object. However, when any changes are made, the object redraws to a bounding box. This can be adjusted in the Options panel by changing the bounding box point polygon threshold to a number higher than the object contains. This information can be found in the Objects panel under Current Object. Now in the Layout view, changes can be made without the object redrawing to a bounding box form. Once again, any adjustments made to lighting can now be viewed interactively.
Next, we need to decide what we want to work with. Here we decide what we want to work with, either the view, objects, bone. For right now, view is selected. Next, we decide what we want to do, whether we want to move the view, rotate it, zoom in or out on it, etc. So in this case, if I select Move and hold down the left mouse button and move it around, notice I'm moving the whole view that we're looking at. Same with Rotate. Select Rotate, move the mouse around, I'm rotating our view. So notice now we're kind of, again, looking at this from a third-party point of view. Here is my camera looking at the cow. We're looking at the back end of the cow in this case. If I select something different in the Edit view, that will become highlighted. For instance, if I choose Objects, it will highlight an object in the scene, and it tells me down here which is the current object. If I had more than one object, I could scroll through this list and choose them. But notice the cow becomes highlighted, and now I have different options in the mouse section. For instance, with an object, I can move, rotate it, size, stretch, or move a pivot point. If I go up to the Edit menu and choose Camera, notice with the camera, I can either move or rotate the camera. By hitting the space bar, you can cycle through your options here. For instance, let's go back to Objects, and if I hit the space bar, notice how it cycles through my different functions that I can control. Also, an important thing to remember is that if you need help, if you hit the Help key on an Amiga or the F1 key on other systems, it will bring up a keyboard shortcuts list, which gives you all the shortcuts that are possible in the current screen you're in. And if you're in a different panel, for instance, we're in the Objects panel, hitting the F1 key or the Help key will present the shortcuts that just pertain to this panel. Okay, so let's go back to our layout. We have the object selected, and I can choose different items by either clicking on them here, or I can click directly on them in the screen by holding down the Shift key and clicking the left mouse button on the object I want to pick. If you have a 3-button mouse, you can select the middle mouse button and click on the object you want to select, and that's the same as holding the Shift key and clicking with the left mouse button. The thing we have to remember when you're working in Lightwave is that when you create an image, or in Lightwave it's called rendering an image, when you render that image out, it renders it from the camera's point of view. So you have to make sure that you go up to the view and select Camera, and that's what you're going to see when we render this out. So let's say we wanted to set up a simple scene with this cow, just a still image. First of all, I probably don't want to look at the butt end of the cow, so I'm going to select that object. I'm going to use the middle mouse button to highlight it. Notice that object is selected. It tells me that the cow is the current item. And I'm going to move this cow. So first of all, I have move selected. And notice I have 3 buttons down here that are highlighted, X, Y, and Z. Let's go back to our perspective view for a minute to explain what those are. I'm going to edit the view, select rotate, and just rotate this around a little bit. And I'm also going to zoom out. So I'm selecting zoom factor. And by holding the left mouse button down, I'm just moving it to the left, which pulls us out from the scene a little bit. And now let's just rotate it so we look down on it. Okay. Now if you'll notice here, it's kind of hard to see, but there is a minus X, a plus X, there's a plus Z here, and if we rotate the view around, we have a minus Z on the back side. Okay. We also have another axis in Lightwave's virtual world, and that's the Y axis. Plus Y is above the grid, and minus Y is below the grid. Now the very center of the grid, where the cow happens to be standing, is known as 0, 0, 0. And if we select the cow object, notice that it tells us where the coordinates are if we look in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. X is 0, Y is 0, Z is 0. Now we can decide to move that object either right, left, up or down, in or out, okay? And we do that with the mouse. Now, first of all, notice we have 3 buttons down here, X, Y, and Z. And those represent, of course, the X, Y, and Z axes that we just talked about. And by deselecting them, I can constrain movement along any of these. For instance, if I just wanted to move the cow along the X axis, I would deselect Y and Z. By doing so and holding the left mouse button down, notice when I move the cow, it moves to the right and left, relative to where we're standing in this case. Okay, let's move that back. We're going to deselect X and turn on Z instead. And Z, by holding the left mouse button down, allows us to move the cow forward on the positive Z axis or backwards on the negative Z. And again, if you look in the lower left-hand corner as you move the cow, notice how the coordinates read where that location is. Finally, we have the Y axis. I'm going to turn off Z and turn on Y. And Y axis is a little bit different because it's controlled with the right mouse button. So by holding the right mouse button down, I can move the cow either up or down. Okay? Now, I don't have to turn these off if I don't want to. I can leave them all on, and therefore, using the left mouse, I can move the cow to the right and left, plus in and out. And again, with the right mouse button, moves the cow up and down. At any point, if I want to reset the cow's position back to where it was originally located, which is the middle of the grid, or 0, 0, 0, all I have to do is hit the reset button down here and make sure that these 3 axes are selected. Hitting reset will reset my coordinates to 0, 0, 0. If I had moved the cow over and let's say moved it up with the right mouse, and I just wanted to reset the Y coordinates, I could turn off the Z and the X, hit reset, and notice that it'll move the Y back to 0, but leave X and Z where they are. Now that we know how to move, let's talk about rotate next. So to do that, let's just use a different object for fun. Let's go to the scene panel and click on the clear scene button. Lightwave will ask you if you're sure you want to clear it. We'll say yes. Okay, when we hit continue, notice we've reset everything. We've gotten rid of all of our objects, all of our images. Anything we had loaded is gone.
In Lightwave 5.0, the scene panel has been modified. Scene loading options have been removed from the top of the panel and added to a pop-up menu. The file pop-up contains functions for clearing a scene, loading a scene, saving a scene, quitting Lightwave, and information about Lightwave 3D. Another modification to the Lightwave scene panel is that the statistics section has been removed and is now accessed by pressing the W key on the keyboard. This displays objects, points, surfaces, lights, polygons, and images used in the scene.
Okay, so let's go to Objects, click on Load Object, and this time let's go to the Aviation directory, and let's just load up the DC-10 object. Okay. And again, let's change our perspective view on it a little bit. We'll look down a little bit on it, like so. And let's select Objects. We'll click the middle mouse button. And this time we're going to select Rotate. And now we have, instead of X, Y, and Z, we have H, P, and B buttons. H, P, and B stand for heading, pitch, and bank. When talking about heading, pitch, and bank, it helps to think of yourself as in an airplane. That's why we've loaded an airplane object here. So we're going to deselect the pitch and the bank, talk about heading first, and by holding the left mouse button down and sliding the mouse to the left or to the right determines which way the plane is headed. And just like with movement, notice the lower coordinates window in the lower right-hand side tells us which way we've rotated the heading, either negative or positive. Again, we can reset the heading, just the same as resetting X, Y, or Z by hitting the reset button. Let's talk about pitch next. Pitch lets you pitch forwards by holding the left mouse button and moving the mouse, or pitching backwards. Okay? And finally, bank, like moving along the y-axis, bank has to use the right mouse button, and that banks the plane either to the right or to the left. Okay? I'm going to reselect all of these, hit reset, and notice, just like with X, Y, and Z, if I hold the left mouse button down, I can both change the pitch and the heading at the same time. And by hitting the right mouse button, I can change the bank. Okay, so let's reset all of those. We've talked about X, Y, and Z movement. We've talked about rotation. A couple other things we can do with objects is we can size or stretch them. Size and stretch are very similar, so let's talk about stretch first. By selecting the stretch button, we can again constrain the stretch movements along the X, Y, or Z. So first of all, we're going to stretch along the X with the left mouse button down. Notice what I'm doing is stretching the plane along its X-axis. I can either shrink it so it's tight and skinny, or do it so it's wide and fat. And again, notice our scale changes in the lower left-hand coordinates window. It tells us right now, for instance, that we have set it to about 2 times its normal width. Now, by the way, if you want to input any of these values exactly, let's say, for instance, we need to have the plane exactly 2.5 times as wide, we can go to the numeric button down here and just input the value of 2.5. And by hitting enter, it automatically takes you to the next field where you can type in another value, or you can just hit enter to clear those and go out. And notice now my coordinates down here read the scale is 2.5 on the X. I'm going to reset that, deselect X, let's select Z, and again, just like movement along the Z, we slide the mouse forward or backwards, and that stretches the plane along the Z axis. And with the Y, we use the right mouse button again, and that changes the height of the plane. Size is very similar to stretch, except that it sizes the plane equally along all dimensions. Let's just reset all of those. And now when I size it, even if I have some of these deselected, notice that all my values read the same in the lower window here when I size it. Okay, we're going to reset everything here. All right, now that you understand how to modify your objects, remember that you can do the same thing to your lights in your camera. And I'm just going to select camera here, and notice because we're in the perspective view, I can zoom in on the camera, so to say, by just clicking on the center button. And that's going to move the whole view so the center is centered up in the screen. And if I was looking at this from a different point of view, for instance, let's select view and move. Let's get the camera out of range. Let's just say we were looking at this from the top or the side point of view. Let's choose top. Again, with edit camera selected, hitting center will bring the camera into the center of the view. Note that this isn't actually moving that item, but it's moving the whole view to center on that. Okay, and just like with the objects, we have move and rotate. Notice we don't have size or stretch because we can't change that on a camera. And we can also do it on the lights. I'm going to select lights, hit center to center up that light. And notice that we have a light right in the middle of the plane in this case. I can move that up above, rotate it just like I do with the objects to get a different angle on it. And by changing your views from front, top, and side, you can see exactly how you're lighting that object. So you might want to try a couple different moves on the light, maybe rotate it a bit, and you generally want to end up looking at it from a couple different angles to get things into the right position. But remember, you always want to look at things from the camera point of view before you render your scene, because that's what Lightwave sees, and that's the image you're going to end up with. The next thing we're going to discuss is how to create an animation within Lightwave. A computer-generated animation is simply a series of still images viewed in sequence. In Lightwave, you create an animation by telling Lightwave how many frames to render, where your objects are located in the first frame, where they're located in the last frame, perhaps a few frames in between, and then when you render that out, Lightwave renders all the in-between frames to complete the animation. Let's get started. I'm simply going to go to the Objects panel and load up an object, and this time we're going to go to the Space directory, and let's select the simple spaceship object. Hit Continue. Notice the spaceship is in the layout. I'm going to select that object. I'm going to go to the view and change it to camera view because remember we want to look at things from the camera point of view. And the first thing we're going to do is decide where we want the object to be in the first frame. Before that, let's decide how many frames we're going to render. I'm going to go to the Scene panel, and by default, Lightwave is set to have the first frame set at number 1 and the last frame set at frame 30. At NTSC video rates, this is 1 second's worth of animation. Well, let's say we want to set up a 4-second animation. We would change the last frame value to 120 frames. Okay? Frame step simply refers to which frame to render. If you leave that at 1, it's going to render every single frame. If you set that to 3, Lightwave would render every third frame. So let's just leave that at 1, hit Continue and return to layout. Now we're in the camera view already, so let's take the object and let's just rotate that into the position we want it to be when we start. And I'm going to kind of angle it down here. And now I'm going to select Move and move it towards the camera. And I'm using the right mouse button to move it up. And then I'm using the left mouse button to move it back on the Z just so it's off frame, like so. And now that's where I want the very first frame of the animation to be. So what I have to do is tell Lightwave to create a key at that point. At this point I select the Create Key button down at the bottom of the screen, and Lightwave will default to whichever frame I happen to be on. That's this current frame value right here, and because I'm on frame 0, it's set to create a key at 0. That's where I want it to be, so I'm just going to say OK. And now we can either go to the last frame, which is 120, so I'm going to select the current frame, type in 120, and remember to hit return after typing in values, otherwise Lightwave won't remember that. And now I'm simply going to move the ship way out here, and let's also rotate it so it's kind of angled back up. And I'm going to look at this from the top point of view, and remember I can hit the center button to center the ship in the view. Let's look at it from the side. I do want to have it angled up, like it's flying out of frame. Let's go back to camera. Now let's move it by selecting the Move button off to the side, and then with the right mouse button move it up so it's just off frame. And now I'm going to create a key. And notice because I set our current frame to 120, when I bring up the Create Key requester, that's now set at 120. So we'll say OK at that point. And now I want to do some frame in between. So let's just go to frame 60. And notice this slider right here. This is the current frame slider. By sliding that, I can change what frame we're on. So I'm just going to slide that so we're at about frame 60, which would be halfway through. I can also use the arrow buttons right and left. And now I'm going to move the ship down, and I'm going to move it over here. Let's just move it down a bit more. Choose Rotate, and now I'm going to angle it up and use the right mouse button to bank it. And let's just rotate it a bit like so. Okay. Now I'm going to create another key. I can hit the Enter key to bring up the Create Key requester. And a quick keyboard shortcut is hit the Enter key again. So a quick way of creating keys is just go Enter, Enter. Notice this line right here, that's the motion path. And you can elect whether to show that motion path by going into the Options panel and choosing Show Motion Path. By default, that's selected on. And if we look at this from the side view, I'm going to center the ship by hitting Center. And by using the comma keys, the comma and the period key on the keyboard, you can zoom the view in or out. So I've zoomed out. Notice the motion path here. I'm going to go through the frame slider. We start off at the beginning. There's our camera right there. It's a little hard to see. There's our ship. By sliding the frame slider, you'll notice that the ship goes along that path. Okay, let's look at that from the camera point of view. I'm just going to select camera to get rid of that path. And now as we go through, I'm sliding it forward. Notice the ship comes into view, banks down a little bit, and then it zooms off. Okay, another thing we can do in the options panel is turn off the grid. I don't necessarily want to see this now, so I'm going to go to options. The layout grid pop-up menu is right here. I'm just going to select off. Hit continue. That leaves my space nice and clear. Now, in order to see this played back in pretty much real time, we can create what's known as a preview. There's a preview pop-up button right over here. And we have a couple of different options in here. I'm going to select Make Preview, and we get the Make Preview requester. And this lets you select a first frame and last frame. I'm going to set my first frame to 1, last frame to 120. Again, we have frame step, which tells us what number of frames to render. And we can either choose bounding box or wireframe. If we choose bounding box, we'll get just that box representing the general width, shape, and depth of the object. But I'm going to choose wireframe because this is a fast machine and it will generate very quickly. If you have very complicated objects, you may want to use bounding box because your preview is going to generate much faster. Okay, after we've selected our options, I'm just going to select OK, and Lightwave is going to make the animation. Now remember, all I did is I set a first frame, a middle frame, and a last frame. Lightwave's putting in all those in-between frames. Once our wireframe is generated, the Preview Playback Controls panel comes up. And this is pretty much a VCR that lets you play an animation forwards or backwards. And also lets you choose the frame rate in frames per second at how we want to see that. Again, NTSC video rates are 30 frames per second, so we're going to leave that at 30. And by hitting the play button right here, that's going to loop through the animation and play our wireframe. And notice the ship comes in, it flies to our position, and then it flies off screen. We can stop it, pause it. We can move this by sliding the frame slider. We can play it backwards. Or we can step through it one frame at a time. Okay, so let's say we don't like this animation. We want to change this a little bit. First you have to click on End Preview to get back to layout. And let's say, for instance, we want to go to our keyframe at frame 60. There's a keyframe button right here, Previous and Next. These allow you to select the previous keyframe or the next keyframe. And by cycling through those, you can go to all the keyframes of your object. Notice what's happening here. I have camera selected, and I only have one keyframe for the camera, which is at frame 0. Okay? Now, the reason we have keyframes at frame 0 is because items have to be somewhere at the start of an animation. So frame 0, even though you don't render that frame in most cases, that's where your items are still parked, so to say. So in most cases, you have a keyframe at frame 0 for your camera, for your lights, and for the beginning of your animation. Let's select Objects. Here, if we select Next, notice we cycle through the frames. We're on frame 60, we're on frame 120, hit Next again, we go to frame 0. The keyboard shortcut for that is holding the Shift key down and hitting the right and left arrow buttons. If we don't hold the Shift key down, we can use the right and left arrow buttons to go through a frame at a time. Okay, well let's go to our frame 60. That's a keyframe. And let's say we just wanted to make this spaceship do a barrel roll. So I'm going to make sure Rotate is selected. I'm going to take the right mouse button, hold that down, and just rotate the ship so it's laying on its back, basically. Let's recreate that keyframe by hitting Create Key and OK. That will overwrite the old values. Notice that my bank is at negative 211 degrees. If I go to frame 0, my bank is at 0. Next is negative 211. Next is back to 0. So let's make this a negative value as well. Let's make it even more than negative 211. Let's make it negative 330 is fine. We'll create a key. This way I'm going to continue the barrel roll throughout the animation. All right, let's take a look at this. I'm going to go Preview, Make Preview, Wireframe, hit OK. And notice now the ship is going through a barrel roll as it goes throughout the animation. Let's play that a couple times. And you'll see that now we've created an animation where the ship flies away from us and barrel rolls throughout. Okay, well, you can add other keyframes. Let's select Objects, go to the next frame. Let's say instead of this location, I wanted it over here instead. All I have to do is move it. If I want to size it out at this point, maybe stretch it along the x-axis or the y, give it some weird shape, I can do that, recreate the key. Again, Lightwave is going to do all the in-between frames. It knows that by frame 60, it has to be this certain size, so it's going to size out a little bit in every frame until it gets to that. And then at frame 120, it knows it has to be back down to normal, so it's going to start shrinking back. Lightwave's putting in all the in-between frames for you. You just set your keyframes where you want them. And in general, the less keyframes, the better. You'll get smoother motions if you use fewer keyframes. Now remember, not only can you give keyframes to your objects, but you can also keyframe your light sources and your camera. That means the camera can be moving around while the ship is moving, and your light could be moving also. Okay, once you've set up your frames and you're happy with the animation, chances are you're going to want to save it so you don't have to recreate it later. If you go to the scene panel, you have the ability to save or load scenes. We're going to save this. Select Save Scene. That brings up the Save Scene requester, and you can choose a location for it. Generally, you want to save it in the Scenes directory, and I'm just going to save this in a directory, no, we'll save it in the Space directory. And by default, Lightwave looks to a .lws for the extension of a scene file. So I'm going to just clear out that, and let's call this Spaceship Move .lws. Hit OK, that will save it. Notice it tells me what the name of the current scene is. Okay. A Lightwave scene file is simply a list of all the objects you've loaded, as well as their keyframe positions. It also includes the positions of the camera and all your lights, as well as the light colors, your background colors, the resolution you're rendering in, basically all the things needed to recreate the scene. Once you have your animation set up, chances are you're going to want to render a few frames to see what it looks like. So let's talk about rendering next. First thing I want to do is find a good frame to render, so I'm just going to slide through until we get the ship in frame. Okay, let's call that frame as the one we want, frame 19, we'll remember that. We want to go to the camera panel, and here's where we set up the resolution that we're going to render in. Okay, right now I'm set to a medium resolution. I can go anywhere from a super low resolution, which when using square pixels in this case is 160 by 120, up to a print resolution which is 2560 by 1920. I can also choose a custom size and type in any values I want at this point. But we're just going to go to a medium resolution, turn off custom size. I also have a number of different pixel aspects I can use when rendering this image out. Now because I'm going to render to my computer monitor, I want to use square pixels. However, if I was using an Amiga monitor, that uses non-square pixels, which are the D2 aspect. So I would switch my pixel aspect ratio to D2. If I was rendering to a display device such as a perception video recorder, I would want to choose D1 in that case. So basically you have to remember what your final output is going to be and then use the appropriate pixel aspect ratio. Again, because I'm using a PC computer monitor, I'm going to switch mine to square pixels. Let's hit continue to exit this panel. Now the other thing, I need to display this somehow, so I'm going to go to the record panel, and here I can choose my render display. Depending on what operating system you use, you're going to have different options in the render display pop-up. On the PC, I have the option of full-size window. So I'm going to select that, hit continue. Now also on the PC, in the options panel, I have the ability to show the rendering in progress. On the Amiga, this automatically happens, but on the non-Amiga systems, I can elect whether I'm going to choose that or not. Okay, I'm just going to say show rendering progress is yes. We'll say continue. And now I'm going to render this frame out. And I can do this a couple of different ways. I can first click on the render button, and it will ask me, okay, what frame is the first frame you want to render, which frame is the last. So I could type in 19 here, and then just hit OK. Notice this also gives me some data as to the resolution I'm rendering at, the size of the window, etc. So let's just say OK, render this out. And there's my full-size image when we're done. Okay, now notice we kind of have some blocky lines in here. This is because I'm not using any anti-aliasing, plus the fact that this object isn't very detailed. To get out of viewing the full-size display, all you have to do is hit any key on the keyboard or hit a mouse button. And then we can choose to abort from this render status panel. All right, I'm going to go back to the camera panel. Notice we have a section called anti-aliasing, and right now it's set to off. I'm going to just set that to medium, hit continue, and render this out again. This time, instead of hitting the render button, I'm going to hit the F9 key on the keyboard to render the current frame. And because I'm on frame 19, it's going to render that. Notice what's happening as it renders each segment here. We see a number of little white lines kind of going through around the edges. This is Lightwave's anti-aliasing passes that it's doing, and it's going in and smoothing out all the blocky edges. So notice here that the full-size display looks much smoother. We still have kind of blocky ship just because it's not very detailed, but notice if you look at the diagonal edges, it's much smoother. Again, I'm going to hit a mouse button to get out of the full-size display, abort out of that. Now that you've done a couple test renders and everything's looking good, you're going to want to save out your full animation. So to do that, we have to go back to the record panel. Let's turn off render display, turn off the full-size window. This is going to save us time in rendering because it doesn't have to display that whole window. Now the other thing we want to do is decide how we want to save this. We can either save individual images, which would be RGB files, or we can save an animation. And on a PC, we have the ability to save an AVI file. Okay? Well, I'm going to select that to none. I'm not going to save an animation. I want to save individual files. Because in order to see a Lightwave animation in full color, 24-bit color, you need to save the individual files and then display them on some type of output display device. Now, if you're using a NewTek flyer, that could be a flyer clip that you're displaying. If you're using a DPS perception card, you could display the images on that, or any other number of different devices. So let's select Save RGB, and I need to select a location where I want to save these individual files to. And remember, in this case, there's going to be 120 separate images, so you want to make sure you have enough room on your hard drive. I'm just going to go to a directory that I have called Images Out, and I'm just going to give this a name of Spaceship. And I'm not going to add any extension to this. I'm going to hit return. Now, right here I can tell Lightwave what kind of file name format to use. Okay, right now it's set to the name, and then it's going to use 4 digits after it, because all these images saved will have a numbered sequence at the end of them. I can select whether I want just the name with the sequence, or the name with the sequence with a .iff or whatever format I'm saving in. And that format is found right below here. And if you've installed your HIP plugins that come with Lightwave, you have a number of different options for saving. I'm just going to select 24-bit IFF. Okay. And that's all I need to really do in this panel. Hit continue. Before I set up my final render, I want to go to the options panel and turn off the Show Rendering in Progress button. This again is going to help speed up rendering time. Hit continue there. At this point, it's a good idea to save the scene again, because the scene file will remember the recording information I've just entered. So the next time I load the scene, all I have to do is go click on the Save RGB buttons, and all that information will be entered for us. So I'm going to save the scene again. Remember here, we want to change our first frame to 1, last frame to 120, save scene. Just going to write this over. Lightwave knows it already exists. It's going to ask you if you want to overwrite it. Say yes to that. Hit continue, and now we go to the render panel, and down here is where I tell it to render frames 1 through 120. This time I want to select automatic. And that way Lightwave is going to render frame 1, then frame 2, then frame 3, and it's going to render them all until there are no frames left to render, and then you're done. So we hit automatic, we hit OK, and notice we get our little status window up here. Lightwave's going through and rendering at this point, and it tells you how long each frame took. Notice these frames in the beginning are going very fast because the spaceship's not in there. And once we've rendered out our 120 frames, then we can either bring them into a video toaster flyer or into the perception or a PAR card, all the different output display devices, and then view them in full color. Here's the animation fully rendered being played back in real time off of a DPS perception card. Notice the animation matches exactly what you've set up in the wireframe preview, but this time it's being displayed in full color. So far, we've just been using pre-built objects that come with Lightwave. But let's say you want to design your own objects. Well, that's where Modeler comes into play. So let's go back to our Program Manager and double-click on the Modeler icon, and this presents our Modeler display. Again, we're running this at 640 by 480, so we'd have much more room if we ran at a higher resolution. The main interface is divided up into 4 sections, or quads. The row buttons at the top remain the same, but as we click on them, the buttons down the left-hand side change. And just as in Lightwave, each of these buttons deals with a certain section of Modeler. In the Objects panel, first of all, we have the ability to load and save objects, as well as creating what are known as primitives. Let's just start by loading the spaceship object that we were just working with. And all I have to do is find the NewTek Objects directory, go down to Space, and load up the spaceship. And notice when it loads in that we're only looking at the middle section of this. The first thing you want to learn in Modeler is how to size your windows around, and you do that by hitting the A key on the keyboard. Again, keyboard shortcuts are used extensively in Modeler, and you can access those by hitting the Help key. And notice we have a scrolling list of keyboard shortcuts that we can go through. Okay. Well, now that we fit this around, notice that we're looking at it from 3 different angles, similar to the front, top, and side views in Layout. I can drag the views around by grabbing these crosshairs in the middle of the screen and dragging them to my liking. And then once I get it where I want it, I can hit the A key again to fit the ship into all the views. So let's just center it up here, hit A. And notice if we look in one of these windows, we have the +C, -C, and this says we're in the top view. This is just like the top view in Layout where we're looking down upon the object. This is the front view, or the face view, and here we look along the X-axis and the Y. And from the side view, we see the Z and the Y-axis. So all these views are labeled, and if you look at the solid black crosshairs in the middle, where they intersect represents the location of 000, which corresponds to the middle of Lightwave's layout grid. All right, well, let's just clear this object out by hitting the New button. And it'll ask you if you are sure you want to do this. I'm just going to say OK. And we're going to start by creating our own object. So we're going to create just a very primitive box. We can select Box. And with the left mouse button, you draw it out. And notice I'm doing it from the top view here. But notice the other 2 views are perfectly flat. If I made this at this point, it would be like a piece of paper. I want to go to another view here and just give it some dimension. Okay? And once I've drawn out the box shape, all I have to do is either click on the Make button or hit the Return key on the keyboard. Now I have a box, and to prove that, I'm going to go to the Display panel, choose Options. The keyboard equivalent for that is D. And I'm going to choose a solid preview. Note that this window now becomes active, and by grabbing with the left mouse button, I can move my box around. That's just a 3D perspective of the box.
In version 5.0, new display modes have been added to Lightwave Modeler. In addition to the solid views and wireframe views, there are now OpenGL modes, which allow objects to be viewed in a real-time, full-color, solid-shaded environment. Both Layout and Modeler support OpenGL hardware acceleration.
Okay, well that's a very simple primitive. Let's just cut that out. And notice these buttons at the bottom of the screen. I have Cut, Copy, and Paste. Those are very similar to a word processor. I can cut it and then paste it in again later if I wish. Now this simple box object is made up of a couple of different things. It's composed of points, which define the corners of the box, and polygons, which when you connect those points together, form faces to make the sides of the box. Now when you're working with an item in Modeler, you choose whether you want to work on the points, the polygons, or a volume, which may include a number of points or polygons. First of all, I'm going to select points, and by holding the left mouse button down, I'm just going to pass the cursor over these top points. Now notice when I did that they became highlighted, plus this area right here tells me how many I have selected. Currently I have 4 selected. Even though it looked as if I was just selecting 2, remember that from the top view, I'm also selecting the ones in back. Modeler doesn't know whether you mean the front or the back ones, so if you just want to work with the front ones, for instance, you may want to go up to the top view and deselect these. And to do that, since we've let go of the mouse button after we've selected them, all I have to do is go and hold the mouse button down again and run my cursor over those points. Okay, if I want to reselect these points, there's a couple of ways of doing that. I can hold the Shift key down and select them. But remember, since I'm doing it from the top view, I also selected the bottom one, so I may want to deselect that. Or if I hold the middle mouse button down, that automatically puts me back into select mode, and I can run over the points again. Okay? Well, let's deselect that so we have just these top 4 selected. And I can tell by looking at the 3 different views, these 4 are highlighted. They're highlighted here, and they're highlighted here. So I know that it's all 4 at the top. Now, if I wanted to deselect all of them at once, all I have to do is click in this blank area anywhere between the buttons. Usually there's a blank area at the bottom of the left-hand side of buttons. So I'm just going to click there with the left mouse button. That deselects them. Another very simple way of selecting points and polygons is by holding the right mouse button down and drawing a circle or lasso around the points. Once I've let go and they've selected, I can deselect them the same way by holding the right mouse button down and drawing a lasso around the ones I want to deselect. Again, if I want to reselect some using lasso mode, I'd have to hold the Shift key down and right mouse button around the points I want to select. Okay, so let's go through a process. I've selected the top 4 points now. It tells me I have 4 selected. Now, once I've selected them, I can choose to modify them. What we do is go to the Modify panel, and I have a couple things I can do. I can move, rotate, size, stretch. These are similar to the same functions in Layout, except when you do them in Modeler, you're actually modifying the shape of the object. In Layout, it's only temporary during the scene. Okay, let's select Move, and since I have these 4 points selected, they're going to be modified by the Move command. All I need to do is hold the left mouse button down in whichever window I want to move them in. I'm going to choose the face view, hold the left mouse button down, and notice when I slide the mouse to the left or to the right, my points follow. And I can move them up and down as well. Okay, let's say I've moved them and I decide that I don't like that. I can just hit the Undo button down in the lower right-hand corner. But if I then decided I wanted to do that, I could hit Redo, which would bring it right back. Now, the number of undo levels are defined in the Objects panel, Options. Undo levels right now by default are set to 3. You can change them up to 15. Okay? So I'm just going to undo that, get the box back where it was. Now, the other things you can do in Modify, we can of course rotate. So if I rotate from the upper view, it's going to spin them around like so. Notice how it changes my object up here. Undo that. I can size. I can stretch, which are very similar to the layout functions. There's a lot of other functions in the Modify panel which we're not going to cover now, but we do cover them in other tapes. All right, well, we played with points a little bit. Let's deselect all of these points, and notice what I have to do since I have the stretch button on, and notice this button stays highlighted. If I try to do anything like deselect the points, they won't deselect until I first turn off that button, just by clicking on it again. Okay, once I've done that, now I can deselect the points. Let's change it to polygon selection mode down at the bottom in the selection area. This time, instead of dragging my cursor over the points, when I hold the left mouse button down and drag over the polygon edges, notice that they become highlighted and these little hairs stick out from them. These hairs are called surface normals, and they represent which side the camera will see this polygon from. Think of them as one-way mirrors. If the camera is inside this box looking out, I wouldn't see any of these faces. But if the camera is outside looking at it, I would see all of them. Well, just like with point selection, I can deselect ones by holding the left mouse button down in another window and just hitting the ones I want to deselect. And again, remember when I click on this edge, Modeler selects these 3 because it doesn't know whether I mean the front one, the side edge, or the back one, so it selects all of them for you. Again, I can go deselect them in another window. And similar to point selection mode, I can hold the right mouse button down and lasso just the polygons I want to select. Now if I go to the Modify menu and choose Move, it moves that entire polygon. Notice the same thing pretty much is happening as when I was moving the 4 points of that polygon, because when the points are moved, the polygons associated with them move as well. However, if I just go in, I'm going to undo both those. If I just go in and select a single point, I'm going to turn off the back one in the upper view, select move. Notice now I'm just moving that single point, and it changes the shape of our object. Okay, let's undo that. Let's deselect all the points. And let's also get rid of this object. And we're going to do that by just cutting it out, and we're going to paste it into another layer. These buttons at the top of the screen are the layer buttons, and so far we've just been working in one layer. I'm going to select another one here, doesn't matter which one, and I select it by choosing the top button, which will select it as a foreground layer. We'll talk about that more in a second. And since I cut it out, I can now paste it in here, and notice it comes back in the exact same spot. Notice also that this layer now has a little dot in it, which tells us that there's something in this layer. Okay, I'm going to go back to this layer. Notice we still see the dot here, but we don't see the object anymore. If I select the layer button right below the dot, the box is selected as the background layer. Notice we see it, but we see it as a solid black outline. It's good to think of layers as templates. Anything in a background layer, such as the box, will not be affected by what you do in the foreground layer. So I'm going to go to the object panel. This time I'm going to create a primitive ball. And I'm just going to draw out the shape of the ball that I want. It's going to be similar to the box. I can move it around by going to the different views. And hitting the Make button will make our default ball for us. Okay? This is a primitive ball. Notice we can still see the box behind it. So for instance, if I was making a body, I might take this ball, and let's say it was the head, I might move it. And notice I'm not selecting any points or polygons. If I have nothing selected, Modeler assumes I mean everything when I go to move it, or rotate it, whatever. So I'm going to move it, and I'm just going to move it up so it's resting on top of the box. Okay, the same keys as in layout will zoom in and out, the comma and the period keys. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Remember, the A key will fit everything into view. And notice now we basically have a ball on top of the box, but the box didn't move when I was moving the ball. If I hold the Shift key down, I can select both layers as active. Notice the top buttons in both are selected, and now you'll see that they're both white, meaning they're both active layers. And if I were to select Move, everything will move in the scene. Okay, let's just set those back. So it's real handy to use the different layers as different workspaces in Modeler. You can build different parts of objects. Let's say you were building a body or a robot. You could put the head in one layer, the arms in another, the body in another, and the legs in yet another. So get used to using layers because they're real handy. Okay, I'm just going to go back to our ball object. I'm going to hit the A key to fit that into the view. Now one thing you'll want to notice here, I'm going to zoom out a bit, these black crosshairs are located below the ball. If I were to save this object and load it into the layout, this is the area right here that would appear at the center of the grid. So it appears as if the ball was floating above the grid. This is also the origin of that ball. So if I go to rotate this right now, if I were to rotate this in layout, it would rotate about that center, like that. It's not going to rotate around the middle of the ball, unless the ball is centered on these black crosshairs. I'm going to undo that, undo a couple things here, and it will get me back to where I centered it. Hit the A key. Okay. Now this time when I go into layout and rotate it, the ball is going to rotate the way you would think, around the center. So this is really handy. You want to keep that in mind when designing your objects. For instance, if you were designing a cabinet that's sitting on the floor, you might build it so the bottom of the cabinet is resting right on that black crosshair line. Then that way when you load it into layout, it would be sitting on top of the grid. Okay, let's set this back. I'm going to cut this out of here. I don't want to use this ball anymore. This time I'm going to make another ball, but I want to make it a little more defined than what we had. Okay, by default, if I just go in and make a ball, Modeler makes it with a certain number of sides and segments. Let's cut that out. If I select numeric, or N on the keyboard, that will bring up the requester for the ball, and I can tell Modeler how many sides and segments I want to use. all of the primitive functions, such as box, disk, cone, etc., they all have different numeric requesters. In a box, for instance, I can tell it where the low corner is, where the high corner is, and how many segments to make the sides. Okay, well, let's go back to ball, hit numeric, and I'm going to make a more complicated ball. The more polygons your object has, the smoother it appears in layout. So I'm going to make this, let's say 50 sides and 25 segments. A good ballpark is you want to use half the number of segments as sides. And we can also type in where we want the center to be. I'm going to put the center at 0, 0, 0. And the radius, I'm going to make half a meter. Okay, notice I typed in 0.5 here. Modeler by default is working in the metric system. I type 0.5 and it changes it to 500 millimeters, which is half a meter. Let's make this one 500 millimeters. And I can type in 500 mm. I can type in 0.5 m for meter. No matter what I type in, Modeler is going to change it to what I'm using. Okay? So I basically made a ball. When I hit enter or make, it will make that. Notice that it's much more defined. Let's hit the A key to center that up. It takes a little bit longer to redraw because it's more complicated, but it's also smoother. So this is something you might want to do if you're going to be looking at this object close up in layout. You're probably going to want a lot of polygons in it so it appears smooth. Okay, well, let's say that we wanted to now create a couple different surfaces on this ball. In order to make an object different colors, you have to name surfaces, and we name them in Modeler. So what I'm going to do is select a number of polygons. Let's say, for instance, that we wanted to make a couple stripes across this ball. Since it's already divided up into polygons, I can simply go in and select, and I'm going to make this view a little bit bigger. A good keyboard shortcut to remember here is the Control-A shortcut. That will size the window to match the ball in whichever view you're in, so it'll give you a nice large view. If I drag this down and put my cursor over here and went Control-A, it's going to size it up so it fits best in that view. Okay, well, I'm just making this window fairly large so it's easier to work in. Control-A to make this big. I'm going to hold the right mouse button down and just simply lasso the polygons that I want to choose for the stripe. Okay, notice I have these surface normals pointing out. They're telling me all those are selected. I'm going to hold the Shift key down and do the same thing on this side of the ball. Select 2 rows of polygons. And notice I don't have to go back and connect the edge of the lasso. Wherever I stop, it's going to draw a straight line between my beginning and end point. And that selects all of those. Okay? Hit A. Notice I have these 2 rows of polygons selected. I can now name those to whatever I want. Okay? Let's first of all deselect everything to talk about surfaces a little bit more. If I go to the Options panel, by default, Modeler is using a surface called Default. I can change that to whatever I want. And from here on out, whatever I change that to, when I build more objects, they will use whatever the current surface name I've decided upon. You can elect to either change your surfaces before you build objects or after you build them. In most cases, I change them after I build the objects. So I'm going to go to the Polygon panel, and I can select the Surface button. The keyboard shortcut for that is Q. And here I can type in a new name. Let's just call this surface of this ball. Okay? And I'm going to apply. And because I have no polygons selected, Modeler assumes I mean everything. And so now all of these polygons are called ball. They're using that surface name.
In Lightwave 5.0, the Surface panel has many additional capabilities. Surface names can now be edited. Color attributes for the surface can now be selected in Modeler, as well as diffusion, specularity, glossiness, smoothing, double-sided, and smoothing angle. Apply, change, and cancel function the same as in 4.0. And with OpenGL, you can view the results of the surface attributes.
Now, I can have every single polygon named with a different surface name, and therefore I'd have, if there are 128 polygons in this, I'd have 128 different surface names when I go back into layout. But in this case, I elect to have them all using the same name. To make sure that they are all using the same name, I can make sure polygon is selected, and I can go to the display panel and choose stats. The keyboard shortcut for that is W, and this gives me polygon statistics. And this gives me a number of different values, like the number of total polygons, how many of them have 3 points in them, how many have 4, how many have more than 4. But right down here it tells you how many are using these surface names. I have 1,250 polygons using the surface name ball, and that's the only surface name I have in here. Okay, so we know that it's worked and I've changed them to ball. If I wanted to select all of those, I could hit the plus key next to that, and it's automatically going to go through and select all of those polygons. Of course, I can bring up the stats panel again. Let's say I wanted to select all the polygons using 3 points. Hit the plus key next to that. It just selects those, and they appear to be the ones on the top and bottom. Okay, well now we've named all the polygons to ball, but now let's go in and create our stripes. I'm going to go through and circle those polygons. Hold down the Shift key. Go through and circle these polygons. Okay, I have all of these selected. I'm going to hit Q to bring up the surface requester. And let's change this surface to ball stripe. Notice that I can use spaces, punctuation here, it doesn't matter. I'm going to hit apply. And now if I go and look at the polygon statistics by hitting W, I see there are still 1,250 total polygons. 1050 are using the surface name of ball. 200 are using the surface name of ball stripe. Okay, if I wanted to select just those, I could hit the plus key. And now, for instance, I could name these to something else, whatever I want. Or if I wanted to move them, rotate them, whatever. Now, just because I've named them a certain name doesn't mean that's going to define the attributes of this object. I could call this red ball, but when I bring it into layout, it's not going to be red unless I make it red. Okay, now that we've done this to our ball, we've defined the surface names, it's time to save the object out. Going to go to the Objects panel. If I want to give it a new name, I'd click on Save As. If I want to save it using the name of the object I loaded last, I would click on Save. For now, we're going to say Save As. This brings up a requester where I can choose where to save it. I'm just going to save it into the main objects directory, and I'm going to call it ball.lwo. Hit OK. That saves it out. Now that I've saved the object out, I'm ready to bring it back into layout where we do all of our surfacing. So I'm going to minimize Modeler's interface. This will keep it in memories if I need to go back and modify anything. Go to Lightwave, which is minimized right now. Double click on that to bring it up. I'm just going to clear the scene to make sure that there's nothing in there. And now I'm going to go to the Objects panel, choose Load Object. And I'm in the Objects directory. Ball.lwo is there. I'm going to double click on that to load it. Hit Continue. There's my ball. And notice, because we centered it in the middle of the crosshairs in Modeler, that's where it loads in layout, right at the middle of the grid. Okay, now let's just render this out. I'm going to go to the Record panel, choose Full Size Window. I'm going to hit F9 just to render this window out. And notice by default we have a couple of things going on here. First of all, we're seeing all of the faces or polygons, and also it's just that default white color. Every time we create a new object and bring it into layout, this is what it's going to look like. So I'm going to click on the mouse button to clear the full-size window, hit abort. In the Surfaces panel is where we actually define what the object looks like. And notice right now the surface color, if we click on that, it's set to white, which is what we just saw. And the way we have those facets in there, that's because smoothing is not turned on. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn smoothing on. Let's just look at the difference here. I'm going to hit F9 to render this current frame out again. Okay, notice what's happened here? The ball stripes are smooth, but the rest of the ball isn't. That's because, click on that to clear it, go back into Surfaces. That's because I just turned smoothing on for the ball stripe. Remember, we've created a couple of different surfaces here. We have those here for us to pop through. I have ball, ball stripe. Lightwave also has a default surface, but notice that there are 0 polygons using that. Okay? Well, let's go to ball, turn smoothing on. Let's say we wanted to give the ball kind of a blue color. I'm going to click on surface color, and I can just move these sliders to adjust the color range. I'm going to drag the red and the green down a bit, move the blue one up. Okay. If I want to see what that looks like, I can click on the render button on the side here. This renders a little surface sample. Now, you only have this strip if you're using on a non-Amiga system. On an Amiga, you have to hit the S key, which is the keyboard shortcut for rendering out a surface sample. We can also bring up the little options panel to click on a background pattern, which will render this out with a background. Okay, well, let's say we want to give the ball a little more shine. That's specularity. And I can adjust the specular up by using the mini slider here. And once I do that, I have the options of changing the glossiness level. Let's just set it to low, render that sample out, and see we have a little hot spot from the light now. The higher I drag the specular level, the hotter that spot is. And if I change this to maximum glossiness, render this out, notice we have a really tight spot. This would be like a hard plastic shiny object. Okay? Notice my slider value went up to 100%. I can type in values higher than that. By clicking in here, I can go up to 400%, which when I render this out, you'll notice it's a little bit hotter. We'll notice that more when we set it to low so we see more of the spot. There's 400% specular. Here's 100. Notice the difference. I also have the ability to make it luminous, which is going to basically make it appear self-lit. I'm going to take that down. And I can change the diffuse value, which will make it bounce back less light, make it a little darker. There are so many options we can do in the Surfaces panel that we devote an entire tape just to surfaces. Now that we've kind of adjusted the blue ball color the way we want it, let's make it kind of high. We'll make it kind of plastic looking. Let's go to the ball stripes, and let's say we wanted to make the stripes a yellow color. I can drag the blue down, leaving red and green up. That'll create yellow. Let's render this out. That gives me my yellow. Notice that it's not giving me a ball with stripes in here. It's just showing me the colors and the values of the current surface. Okay? Well, chances are we want to use the same specular level, so if a hot spot hits right at the stripe line, it will show up on both surfaces. So I'm going to go back to ball just to check what that was. We're using 100% specular and high. So let's set up the same thing on ball stripe. 100% specular with high. Render that out. Okay. We have both of these set to smooth. Okay, let's go back. This time let's render this frame out again by hitting F9 key. And now you'll see that we have our hot spot and we have our two ball stripes in as well. Okay, again we're kind of have jaggy edges here. I'm going to hit a key to get out of that full-size window. If we go to the camera panel and change our anti-aliasing level, bump that up. Let's hit F9 to render this out again. This time it's going to go through, render all the separate anti-aliasing passes, and then give me a finished image, which is much smoother. Now notice we're also seeing some banding here. That's because my resolution on my computer is using 65,000 colors. If I was using a resolution of 256 colors, that we'd see even more banding. This is done in your control panels, but when you render this out and save this image, you're going to have full 24-bit color, and you won't have that banding effect. Okay, we've pretty much gone through the basics needed in order to get up and running in Layout and Modeler. But let's finish up by doing one more thing, and that's modifying an existing scene. I'm going to go to the Scene panel, and notice even though I still have the ball in here, if I go and load a new scene, it automatically clears the scene first, so you don't have to clear, then load. So I'm going to select Load Scene, and let's load up a scene from the Logos directory called Logo Loop. And let's just make a preview of this from the camera point of view. Make preview wireframe. Basically what this is a logo coming in and some searchlights going over the top of that. Now let's say instead of the world premiere logo, you'd rather have your company logo come in instead. Here's how you do that. Let's just play it here. Let's end the preview. I'm going to minimize Lightwave, and I'm going to go to Modeler, and let's just select New, because we want to get rid of what's in there. And I'm going to first load up that object from the logos directory. And we'll find it. It's the world premiere right there. Okay. Now what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to put this in the background so I can use that as a template because I want to make my logo the same size. So I'm going to go to another layer, put the world premiere one in the background, and now Lightwave Modeler has the ability to create text objects. So I'm going to go to the text button under Objects, and first of all I'm going to add a Type 1 font, and I need to find the PS fonts directory that comes with Lightwave. And I have a couple other fonts in here, but let's select all files, and let's just load up, let's see here. Let's load up this one called Benson. And now I can just type in my text, and I'm going to just type John Gross, all in caps. Okay. Hit A to fit that in. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the lasso to lasso that part. Let's deselect that. Zoom in a bit on this. By the way, if you hold the alternate key down, you can drag the window around with the left mouse button. Okay, I'm going to use the right mouse to select that, select Modify, Move, and I'm going to place it so it's kind of centered below John, like so. I'm going to deselect Move, deselect the polygons, hold down the Alt key again to kind of center it up, and now I'm going to move the whole thing so it kind of fits in where the world premiere is. And the reason I want to make it the same size so I can replace it in the scene and not have to adjust the camera angle and move the lights in on it, etc. So I'm also going to just stretch it down a little bit, holding down the left mouse button, and I'm stretching from the center, which pulls it in. Okay, and that's pretty close, so we're going to go with that. We don't need to see this in the background anymore, so I'm just going to select this as the foreground. Now, the one thing about it is we're basically looking at a flat object if we look at it from another angle. I'm going to hit the D key to bring up the display, select solid. Okay, notice it's just a very flat object here. We want to give it a little bit of extrusion, so I'm going to go to the multiply panel, click on extrude, and I'm going to click in the window I want to extrude along. So I click here, and notice I get a line out here. This represents how far I'm going to extrude it. Let's just make it about there. Hit the Enter key, and that creates back and side faces for my object. Let's center this up, and you'll notice once this redraws here that I actually have sides in there. Okay, so that's how we do it. Now let's save this object out, and before I do that I may want to change some surface names. I might want to make the sides a different color from the fronts, for instance, but for now we're just going to change them all. Hit the Q button, change this all to, just call it logo. Go to Object, Save As. I'm going to go to the Objects panel and just save it as John logo. Hit OK. Going to minimize Modeler, go back into Layout. Now, if we scroll through our scene, we have our world premiere object. I just clicked on it with the middle mouse button to select it. Okay, notice it's selected. I'm going to go to the Objects panel, and here I have the ability to replace object. I'm going to replace that with my object that I just created, John logo. Hit OK. What that will do now is clear out the old object, put in the new one in its place, but give it the exact same motion path. So now when I create this animation, let's just make a preview. And do it like so. Do a wireframe for this. Notice now it's the John Gross logo that flies in instead of the world premiere logo. Very simple to do, and this way all the scenes that come with Lightwave you can modify to fit your own objects. Now let's play the preview. Notice now the John Gross logo is in place of the world premiere logo. Okay, let's quit that, go out. Let's just render up a frame. Before we do, let's go to the Surfaces panel and go to Logo, which we just happen to be on. Notice that I already have surface values in here. That's because I happen to use the same surface name that the World Premiere logo used when it was loaded in Modeler, and therefore all the surface names get carried over. So our logos are going to be exactly the same values and color here. And here's the entire animation rendered out. Notice that it only took us a few minutes to set up this logo, but because we replaced it into an existing scene, we have a totally new scene in very little time. Hopefully this brief tutorial has gotten you up and running in Lightwave. Now this is the same package that is used every day to create impressive effects for television, film, and video games. It has a lot of impressive features which I really encourage you to learn. Also, it's a lot of fun. I'm John Gross. Hope to see you soon.